final wash the block, and I do that with soap and water. Take a big bucket of hot water and soap. I use Dawn dishwashing detergent. You want to use some kind of a detergent or a soap when you wash the block. You don't really want to use any kind of brake clean or anything like that, because it that embeds the grit and so forth into it. You need a detergent like a soap to get all the grit out of it. So we final washed the block, and also you can see that we pressed the cam bearings in. Now on the cam bearings themselves, I would just make a note of this. There's an oil gallery hole, feed hole for this cam bearing there. It's important to make sure that those are lined up, simply because there's no groove in there. Small block Chevrolet has a groove that goes all the way around, and if you don't get the hole lined up exactly, the oil is going to follow the groove. On the Buick here, there's no groove, so those holes got to be lined up perfectly. So when we installed the bearings, we were real careful to make sure that all the oil gallery holes, if you don't line those up, then you don't get any oil to your cam, and that would be disastrous. On the main bearings, so these are our 10 under bearings, the thrust bearing on the Buick is in the middle, very similar to a lot of the Fords, which differs a little bit from the small block Chevy, which is the number 5. And also, it's important to make sure that the bearing with the hole in it is lined up with the oil gallery, and you can see that they all are. All the feed holes are lined up. The back bearing, the rear bearing on the Buick, is a little bit wider than the other bearings. So our thrust is going to go in the middle with the flanges here. The other bearings go in the 1, 2, and 4 position. And then the number 5 bearing, it'll be obvious it's slightly wider, and the bore that it fits into is wider as well. If you look at the bearings on the bench here, you can really see this. You can see that number 5 bearing is wider. Also, what we have here is this is the old rear main seal that came out of this engine, and it's a rope type seal. So this is what comes in the kit, and I want to make sure that we get this. I don't know how well you can see this, but I'll just read it to you. It says, to obtain a positive seal, press the packing firmly into the bearing cap groove and then trim the ends flush with the face of the cap. And so basically you roll these in, and I use a large socket, or they have a special tool for it, and it rolls into this groove here. It rolls into the groove on the block, and then there's a groove in the cap. There's 2 pieces. Now, I would caution you guys when you do this, what I'm going to do on that rope seal is I'm going to go ahead and we're going to get the crankshaft in this engine without the rear main seal in. Before I do that, we're going to check the clearances, and I'll walk you through how to do that. But you want to put the crankshaft in without the rear main seal, because the rear main seal on this engine, these actually make the crank pretty hard to turn. And so in order to make sure that the crank is turning smoothly, you have to put it in without this, because then you won't be able to tell whether or not the crank is binding here somewhere, or if it's actually the seal doing it. So we're going to assemble the caps and torque them with the crank in after we get our clearances, and then we're going to pull it back out, and then we'll put our seal in when we're comfortable with the clearances and the way that it turns. So it's pretty important that you do this. So we got our bearings in, and now we're going to turn our attention to the crankshaft. So we've got our crankshaft. This is a parts washer here. We've got our crankshaft in here. This is pretty critical. I want to make sure you guys see this. These oil holes here, when you get a crankshaft back from the grinding shop, it is definitely not ready to install in the motor. I'm gonna brush this hole real quick because I want everybody to see this. Now, see all that black crap and that dirt that just came out of there? That is no good. So we take a brush. They call them a rifle brush or a oil gallery brush, and you can buy these pretty much anywhere. And you got to make sure that you thoroughly clean these oil holes with this brush, and you got to scrub this thing until you get really nothing, no crud coming out of there. If you were to put this crankshaft in the motor with all that stuff coming out of there, you'd have a real problem. So a lot of times these oil galleries, they can be quite time consuming on some cranks. This is a reground crank, and there's, you know, grit from the grinder and sludge and crud that ends up, you know, not being cleaned out of there. And some guys will just get this back from the crank grinder, and they think just because it's in a plastic bag and it looks shiny that they can install it in the motor. That nothing could be further from the truth. So it's really imperative that we brush all of these oil galleries out until we get these absolutely clean. And then once we do that, once we get that done with the solvent here, then we're also going to final wash this thing with soap and water. And we're going to go through it again with the brush and so forth with hot water and soap. And once we get that done, then the crank should be ready to put in. We can check our clearances. So I'm going to go ahead and finish this up. I won't bore you with filming all of it, but I'm going to get this crank absolutely clean, and then we'll move on to the next step, which is checking our clearances. So this is our number one main bearing cap and our number one main bearing. Now on these, it's important that you don't touch the face of this bearing with your finger, because the oil in your fingers can actually create a spot on here that the engine oil does not want to stick to. Kind of treat this bearing like it's a, you know, like it's a DVD or something. You don't want to touch that face. So make sure that the notch lines up with the notch in the cap. And what we're going to do here is we want to go ahead and put the lower bearing in the cap. And keep in mind the caps are directional. Now this one here says number 1, and the arrow is pointing, of course, this way. So this would be the front of the engine. Then we want to take our bolts, put a little lube on the bolts here, and then we're just going to take and set our cap on the engine with the bearings installed, and of course the arrow is facing the front. Now it's real important, you see this gap right here? These caps have an actual pretty snug fit here. They're designed to fit into this pocket or this machined area to keep the cap you know, from moving around when the engine's running. It's real important that you tap this cap down or seat it down in here before you start to tighten these bolts. You can get the bolts started, but you don't want to try to torque them, because if you try to torque them without seating that cap down in, you can actually crack this cap, and if you crack the cap, you got a big problem. A rubber mallet or a soft hammer, and we're gonna, it's a pretty snug fit. You gotta, you know, we're using a rubber hammer, so you're not going to hurt the cap. You got to get it down in there so it's flush here and here. And then at that point, we can go ahead and torque this to specifications, about 90 pounds. We're going to set our torque wrench, and we're going to go ahead and torque this. You want to kind of snug them up gradually. Don't go to full torque. Go ahead and, that's about 60 right there. We'll reset our wrench here for our spec, and we'll go to our final torque on it. Okay, so now once you get that torqued, what we can do, or what we need to do, is we need to check our oil clearance. The way we do that is we're going to mic our crankshaft. We're going to take a micrometer, and we need to know what size the crankshaft journal that rides inside this bore is going to be. And this is our micro. We locked our micrometer. And then we have this dial bore gauge here. So what we do is, with this set at the crankshaft journal size, we go ahead and put our bore gauge in here, and we just basically calibrate our dial with the bore gauge. Now I've already done that. I calibrated it, and you can see with this mic on here, it's right on 0. So the dial bore gauge is calibrated, and so what we do is we just take the dial bore gauge and we basically place it inside the diameter where the bearing is, and then we can see our clearances. Now with this dial bore gauge inside here, I'm showing on my dial down here that I have 3 thousandths clearance, which is exactly what I should have. So I calibrated it to 0 here with the micrometer or with the crank journal size, and when I put this in there, I was about right there, which is 3 thousandths larger than the 0. So it's getting larger, going toward the 90 there. So I have about 3 thousandths clearance here. Now the clearances, you know, the crankshaft journal has to rotate inside here. So the clearance has to be specified, because that clearance is what gives you your oil pressure. The oil pressure comes in around here, and the resistance to the flow of oil based on that clearance is what gives the engine oil pressure. So you have too much clearance, you're going to have low oil pressure. If your clearance is too tight, the crank's probably going to bind up and seize on you. So we're going to go through and check every one of these. You got to check them all. Checking oil clearance is not optional. I won't bore you with doing all that. I have several other videos where I get much more detailed with checking oil clearance, and you can check some of those out, or you can ask questions below. But that's basically in a nutshell what we're going to do. So we're going to go through before we lay the crank in the motor, and we're going to check all of those clearances, and once I get that done, we'll move on to the next step. Now we've established that all of our oil clearances are right. We've got all the caps and bearings cleaned up, put the caps in, checked all our clearances. All the clearances are within specifications. Now we're ready to lay our crank in the engine. And again, keep this in mind. I mentioned this earlier. The rope rear main seal goes here, but at this point I am not going to put that in. And some guys will use assembly lube on these bearings. I just use engine oil. Assembly lube works okay, but I really want to feel how this engine rotates. I like engine assembly lube is fine, but it makes the crankshaft feel a little stiffer than it should be. I like to feel the crank in its natural state, which is with basically motor oil. You can be generous with it. Make sure the bearings are coated. You never want to lay a crank on totally dry bearings. So engine oil works perfectly fine. So our crankshaft, we cleaned it up in the solvent, of course, and final washed it. It's ready to go. So at this point, we're just going to very carefully and gently lay our crank right on those bearings, and then we can start putting our caps on, because we want to make sure that this crankshaft is rotating smoothly. We also, before you put the caps on, you want to get some oil on each one of these journals. You never want to put these bearings in here dry. You get metal to metal contact, so we're going to go ahead and oil them up, and we'll get our caps on there. Remember, the caps are directional. They are, nice thing about Buick is they numbered their caps from the factory, so we've got a number 1 and an arrow pointing that way. Make sure you lube these bolts up too. So again, we're just going to gently lay the caps on here in order. This is number 2. And once we get those caps seated, and again, we want to get that cap seated with a rubber hammer right down there so that we can torque the bolts. Alright folks, so I've got the crankshaft, all the caps seated and all torqued to specifications, and you can see I can turn the crankshaft by hand. This crankshaft should spin nice and free. It shouldn't have any hard spots, any binding, and it doesn't. And we checked the alignment on this block as well when we were checking it out, and it was perfect, so we don't have any misalignment. So that crank feels really nice. Now if I would have put the rear main seal in here, that rope type seal, this thing could have been real tight, and I wouldn't have known if it was the bearings binding it up, the main bore alignment, or the seal. And that's risky, because if you put the seal in there and it happens to be binding because of a problem with the bearings or the caps or the block alignment, you could miss that, and then when you get the engine running in the car, well, you wipe your bearings out. So it's a good practice. It's an extra step, but that's just the way it goes with rope seals. That's what you have to do. And so we got a really nice turning crankshaft here. It's feels really good. We checked the end play with a dial indicator, and we have about 5 thousandths end play, which is good. That's end play is the forward and rearward movement of the crank. So we've got a good end play on that. I'm not gonna do that on camera. There's a lot of other videos. I'll probably throw a clip in there of that taking place so you guys can see it. But the end play is critical, and the crank spinning by hand is critical. So this one feels really good. So we're off to a good start here. And now we can pull the crank and put the seal in, and then we can go on. So what I've done here is I've got the crank, now that we've established that the crank turns well and everything, we've got the crank back out of the engine, and now we have to go back and start thinking about our rope seal. So this is the rope type seal that this engine takes. It's kind of a process to put this in. So basically what you do is you take and you put the rope seal down in this groove, and you want to leave. The rope seal is intentionally made longer than it needs to be for these engines. So what you want to do is you want to leave some of the rope sticking up on the ends, and then you take a tool they actually have a tool made for this, but you can use a big socket, and what you do is you just kind of work that rope seal in, and it takes a little bit of effort and time. You got to get that rope seal down in. You want to get it seated down in there as deep as it's going to go, so you got to put a lot of pressure on it. And you just work it down in there, and once you get it worked down in and you feel you're confident that it is seated down in pretty deep here, then you can cut the ends off of it. And that's, I don't really particularly care for rope seals, but on some of these older engines, this is all we have to work with. So we're going to work this thing down in just like so. We're going to put a lot of pressure on this, and be careful not to dang or damage your bearing here. So we're going to put a lot of pressure on this rope seal, work it down in, and once we get that down in there, like this one looks like it's pretty good. I got it in there pretty tight, about as tight as it's going to get. Then we're just going to take a razor blade. You want to make sure you use a new razor blade, a sharp one for this. So we're going to take a new razor blade here, because these rope seals can be they can be difficult. They can be a little bit hard to cut. So basically you just come to the surface here where it's sticking up, and we're going to take a razor knife and we're going to shave this off of here. So once we get those ends cut off, and then you're going to do the same thing on the upper seal in the cap. You got to work that seal into that cap, and you just kind of got to use the razor knife like a little saw, a little mini saw, and you got to kind of slice through that seal, which is, these seals are It's a fiber type material, and they're actually quite hard to cut. And if you don't have a sharp tool for this, a sharp razor blade, good luck. You're going to be here all day trying to get this thing to come off of there. So we use a sharp razor blade, and you can see I have to put quite a bit of effort in this to get this, to come off of there. I'm really close to getting through this here. I'm probably about 80% through it. So we're just gonna make sure we cut that off of there. We want to keep it as flush with the block as possible. That way the cap won't have any problems fitting on or anything like that. I'm going to go to the back side of it here now. Come in from this side, find my cut, finish cutting that off. Once you get these cut off, I'm going to go ahead and put the other end of the seal in the cap, and then you can just lay your crank back in there just basically like you did. So that's basically what you want. You want to have this flush with the block here. One of the things that we want to check here is ring end gap. This is our ring set. It goes with our pistons. So if you open up the ring set, you can see they got the ring separated in 3 different compartments. They have top, second, and middle. And you'll notice that on the moly rings, the moly coated rings, the second ring has kind of a dark grayish powdery color because it's just a plain ring. The top ring will have like a shinier silver type color, and it tells you in the ring box right here which one's top and second, and then of course your third, which is your oil ring. But that's very typical of a moly ring. The ring, when it sits in the bore, has a gap. This is one of the things that we have to check. We have to take, when this ring is in that bore, we have to know how wide that gap is. So the way you check that is you put your ring in the bore like so. Now in order to check that properly, the ring has to be perfectly square. So what I do is I like to use the piston to square that up. You just take one of your pistons that's going to go in that bore and just run that piston down in until you're sure it's square. And you can use the oil ring groove as a reference here. Just put it in until it's flush all the way around. It's at the same height. And then basically what that does is that squares up that ring. Because if that ring is in there and that ring is off one way or another, then you're going to get a false reading. So you got to square that up and get it in there. Then you take a set of feeler gauges and we're going to check that. Now, as a general rule, you want about 4/1000ths of clearance per inch of bore. So we have over 4 inches here, 4 3/8 basically. So that comes out to about 21 thousandths is what we're looking for on this bore. So that's my 21. So I just put that in there, and that actually is going in with just a little bit. It's just a little bit of resistance, but it is sliding in. So that is a good end gap. We got to make sure that we have that on this bore. So that looks good. We've actually got 21 thousandths there, which is adequate for what we're doing. Now, one of the things to note is that the top ring will have a slightly smaller gap than the second ring. A lot of times you put the top ring in here and the gap is slightly smaller than the second one. I put one of these in earlier and I had 20 thousandths. The 21 didn't quite go, so the 21 is going, and I could probably get a 22 on this second one if I really tried, but 21 is accurate. The reason being is we want a slightly larger gap on the second ring. That way when the blow-by goes down past the first gap, it doesn't get trapped between the two rings. It can actually pass without creating pressure between the rings, because if it creates pressure between the rings, it's going to cause the top ring to want to lift off of the ringland and start fluttering in there. So the current trend in rings, and has been for many years, is to have the second gap slightly larger than the top gap, and that's actually what we have here. So I'm going to go through and I'm going to check every one of these for ring end gap. I won't bore you doing that on camera, but you got to check every one of them. And then what we do is, so this ring, for example, I checked it in this bore. I'm going to keep these in order, and once I get all the gaps checked, I'm going to use that ring that was in that bore. I'm going to use that ring for this particular piston. So we'll go through and check them all, and then once we get that done, we'll move on. Putting the rings on the pistons is pretty straightforward. We're going to put the oil ring expander on, and you want to make sure that the ends of that are butted up like that. Then the scraper, what I like to do is take the scraper, I find the end where it's butted, and I go just to the left of that gap so it holds it together, because the scraper has to be, or the expander has to be butted up. Now these you can roll on because they're spring steel, so I roll that around, get the bottom one on, and you got to have a gap here where the gap in the ring is here. I'll take the upper scraper and I find that gap there, and I go opposite it. I'm going to go over here. I don't want to line those gaps up. And then I just go on the top of that expander, and you roll that right on. Once the oil ring is on, it should move as one piece there. Now on the compression rings, and again it says on our little flapper here, it says top and second, so we're going to go to the second ring first. These rings may be directional. They may have a dot or a mark on them, and these do. I don't know how well you can see that, but there's a dot right here on this ring. The dot always goes up, and you never want to roll these or twist or bend these compression rings, because it can damage the integrity of the ring. So what we do is we use a set of ring pliers here, and you just take your piston, and I like to just kind of use my thumb here. I make sure my dot is up, and we're going to use these expander pliers, and we want to just expand that ring far enough to get it over the piston, and we get it down, we work it down onto that second groove, and you might have to, play with this thing a little to get it into the groove, but you want to get it on that groove like that. And then the top ring, same thing. This is our Molly top ring. Now we're going to look for a dot. A lot of times the top ring is not directional on these, and if there's no dot on the ring, which there's not on this one, then it'll go either way. It doesn't really matter. So generally with a lot of these ring sets, the second ring, because it's a scraper type ring, has a dot, and the top ring does not. And that's basically what your ring should look like once they're on the piston. And you can see the difference color-wise between the Molly ring and the second ring. So the oil ring should move as one piece, and then these two basically on like that. And just repeat that for the rest of the pistons, and then we'll move on and get this thing together.
Well, folks, that's it for part 2. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned. We gotta get the rest of this uploaded as soon as we can. I got a lot of other projects going on, so I'll get it just as soon as I can. Be sure to subscribe below. If you have any questions or comments, go ahead and leave them below, and I'll do my best to respond. I'm kind of overwhelmed with all the questions and so forth, but I'll do the best I can. And hopefully we'll see you soon. Thanks for watching.